Hello, good evening,
Well,
and
that's what Leonard
good evening,
Stein
and
told
welcome to the Menil. I'm Joseph Newland, the Director of Publishing here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Menil for this conversation, which will touch on, among many other things, I'm sure, Walter DiMaria's involvement in the New York downtown music scene, which had recently been involved in. Expanded in the early 1960s by a lot of immigrants coming in from mostly the Bay Area, so there were a lot of dancers, and then two musicians, Lamont Young and Walter DiMaria, who met at Berkeley. We're thrilled to have composer and pianist Michael Harrison with us for this program. He was joined by Brad Epley, who some of you may know as our former curator here, who's now in Santa Fe, and a co-curator of the Meaningless Work Boxes for Meaningless Work exhibition that is right down the hall. And then Sarah Rothenberg, the artistic director of DACAMERA, who will be moderating the conversation and is here in conjunction with also a program that will be held on Saturday. The show is Walter DiMaria, Boxes for Meaningless Work, and it will be on view from now until April 23rd, so you have some time to come back. Tonight's program will also have a bit of a preview of Saturday's performance that is planned for In the Galleries, with Michael Harrison playing his complete work for a just-tuned or a pure intonation-tuned piano revelation, and he'll be presented in the galleries. There are a limited number of seats, so there's actually been pre-registration, and all the registrations have been taken, but there will be a few additional seats available at the time of the performance. If you'll look at the DACAMERA website or the museum's website, you can find out further details. Before we all go, I would like to join you in making sure my phone is silenced and any other noisy devices you may have. There will be a time for questions at the end, so if you have burning ideas or things you wish to ask, please hold those until the end. We're recording the program, and it'll be available on the YouTube channel of the Menil in a few weeks. And we would really like to thank all of our friends at DACAMERA, Brandon Bell, Leo Boucher, and Nick Rainey, and of course Sarah Rothenberg, who's always such an incredibly generous collaborator. Before I turn over to Sarah to introduce our other two guests, let me just say a few things about her. Lauren, who I'm stepping in for tonight, wrote this fabulous introduction, so I'm just going to read it for Sarah. She's a concert pianist, a writer, an educator, a producer, and a creator of interdisciplinary performances linking literature, music, and art, and ideas. She served as DACAMERA's artistic director since 1994. She has taught at Rice University of the Arts, been a senior fellow at the New School's Veritas Center for Art and Politics in New York City, and a visiting artist in Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center here at the University of Houston. She's currently teaching at Columbia University's Graduate School of the Arts. Her writings regularly appear in literary, art, and music publications, and I had the pleasure of working with her on Cy Twombly's Treatise on the Veil, where she wrote about the musical aspects of that, and she also recently contributed to the Moody Center's Mark Rothko publication. So, Sarah.
Thank you, Joseph. It's always such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. And welcome all you fellow Astro fans. It's a great night for all of us to get together. I'm thrilled to be finally having Michael Harrison here in Houston. I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a moment. And welcome back Brad Epley, co-curator of this fascinating exhibit. And for so many years, a member of the Menil family, and it's wonderful to have him back, and glad that you could join us for this chat today. Michael Harrison has been called an American maverick by Philip Glass, and you will hear tonight just a bit about the fascinating work that Michael has been doing on this piano, this modern piano, very same instrument where just 2 weeks ago we heard Jeremy Denk perform Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. And the best way to find out, I think, about what well-tempered means in that context is to hear a piano that is not tempered. It's certainly not ill-tempered. It's just a very different way of tuning a piano, and it opens up all kinds of questions about why a piano is tuned the way it usually is and what this kind of tuning offers to us. Michael Harrison has been a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and he is really the recipient of a legacy, having become a kind of protege of Lamont Young, who you will hear more about soon, but who was so closely affiliated with Walter DiMaria in that downtown scene in New York in the 1960s, and in developing new ways of listening to music and looking at art and making art. And it's kind of a welcome home moment for him to come to the Menil Collection for the first time, because in fact his early work with Lamont Young was supported by the founders of the Dia Foundation, who were notably Dominique and John de Menil's youngest daughter and her husband. So he's known them well, he's been in their house, and so finally coming here to the Menil Collection and staying on this wonderful campus and getting a chance to interact with the art and to bring his music here is really wonderful and very personal. This is yet another project that has been in discussion for years. We broke off our conversations in March of 2020 when we realized the Walter DiMaria exhibit wasn't going to happen exactly on schedule along with everything else in our lives. And we were so glad to bring it back now. So, with that, I think the best place to start is to ask Brad to tell us a little bit about this particular exhibit. So many of these holdings, if not all of them, are actually in the Menil Collection. And why now? Why do this exhibit now? And what did you find about Walter DiMaria coming back to it in the context of today?
Sure. Well, it's really wonderful to be back, and it's really wonderful to see the exhibition, and it's really wonderful to actually finally have Michael here. I don't want to go too much in depth in terms of the Walter DiMaria, because I think the meat of this evening is Michael being here and the insights he has both into his own work, but also how those grew out of his relationship with Lamont. But the impetus for this show was the purchase of several groups of Walter's early works that became available upon his passing. The Menil acquired those. It's around 30 pieces. These were mostly unexhibited or very infrequently exhibited pieces ranging from 1960 to about 1968. And what it provided was the opportunity to really show, I think, Walter's work in depth, and also the long-standing relationship that he had with the Menils, both the children and Dominique as well. So that was really, I think, the main impetus. The collection of early sculptures was furthered by the large purchase of around 600 or 700 drawings a few years later that really make us the largest institutional holders of DiMaria's work, and allow us to present, in particular, the early work in a way that no one else really can. And so I think it was the opportunity and the obligation to do that that this show grew out of. So I have a quick presentation just to give a little bit of background of the environment where Walter and Lamont were working in the early 60s. For those of you who don't know, Walter was a musician. His formative musical training was in piano, but he switched to drums. He then switched to the visual arts at university. He went to Berkeley. But what a lot of people don't know is that Walter moved to New York with Lamont in 1960, and Walter continued to play the drums as he was creating visual art, and was actually in an early iteration of the band that later became the Velvet Underground. So he was with Tony Conrad, Lou Reed, and John Cale for a time. I think there was a bit of a lifestyle that was exhausting to Walter, and he felt like he needed to focus on his visual art, which he has much said. It was too many drugs and staying up too late started to take its toll on him. But that was Walter's. He was very musically involved, really up until 1968. He actually created two works, musical works, where he plays the drums, both of which are included in the exhibition. One is cricket music, which he recorded in 1964. And then the other one is called Ocean Music. And there's a combination of cricket music and ocean music that he used to create the soundtrack for his film Hardcore, which is in the exhibition as well. And this is just a drawing that Walter's wife, Susanna, did of him playing the drums in his studio in the early 1960s. One of the interesting parts of a lot of Walter's early work is that there's an interactive component to it, and I think we'll see that both he and Lamont were working in this way. And one thing that's interesting, but not necessarily we were not able to reflect in the installation just because of the wear and tear it would entail on the pieces, is that there is a sonic component as well as a participatory component. And a lot of those, I think, draw on Walter's percussive experience. So a lot of the works are balls that move through other wooden structures. And in the conservation department, we actually created mock-ups, which you can see. The lighter wood is actually a recreation of this earlier work by Walter called Move the Ball Slowly Down the Row, in which the participant is invited to move this ball through these different segments, in control of the timing of it, and also just understanding, being aware of their movements and also being aware of the noise that it creates. But we were able to create this mock-up so that we could actually work these sculptures or activate them in a way and have a better understanding of how they were experienced by the viewers. Most of them had inscriptions that included the instructions, and so you can see a very faint pencil line that instructs the viewer to move the ball slowly down the row. And here's actually an image of Lamont and his partner Mariana Zazella. And you can also see Lamont was also very interested in the Fluxus movement, these groups of artists, and creating these instructions for performances. So very much drawing on the kind of score, or the idea of a musical score, where there is instructions, but there's also some openness to interpretation based on the conductor and the various skill levels and inspiration of the performers. So this is one that Lamont came up with in 1960. You can probably read it. It involves pretty futile exercise of pushing a piano up into a wall, maybe even being able to push it through the wall, and then finally giving up when you're exhausted. Another work, again, with Lamont, was working through these instructional pieces. Another famous one is simply the instructions are draw a straight line and follow it. This is in Menil's collection, and was in 1960. Again, very similar to works Walter was creating at the same time. And there was a very famous interpretation of this work Nam June Paik performed, where he dipped his head into a bowl of ink and proceeded to draw the line with his hair. So that's the image that you see here. So again, the interest in a certain amount of variability, but also a real interest that both artists had in controlling and dictating the artistic experience, which I think both pursued similarly and also to varying extremes through the course of their career. Walter actually created an instrument for Lamont. I think Lamont was maybe not compelled with it as an instrument as he was with other things, but he did create a way to work through it. The idea was that there's an electronic pickup in one end of this, and the idea is that you move the two ends of the piece so that the ball rolls back and forth, and I think Lamont came up with a way to play it where it has essentially generated a kind of drone tone of the ball rolling back and forth. So again, another point where Lamont and Walter were interacting both visually and orally. And then the other idea that I think I will just end with is this notion of intervals and Walter's ideas about composition and about proportions. And again, this also goes back to controlling the vantage point of a work of art. So this is a piece called The Broken Kilometer. It consists of numerous rods that altogether comprise a kilometer in length, but they're broken up. But upon initially looking at this, the idea is that the interval between all those rods is very much the same. But in actuality, to create the visual effect Walter wanted, the spacing increases very regularly towards the back of the exhibition so that your sense is that there is a very equal proportion. But in fact, there's a very controlled and not necessarily arbitrary, but the ultimate, it's not about the system, it's about the ultimate perception of the artwork. And I think that in many ways relates to some of the experimentation with tuning that both Michael and Lamont experimented with. So just a quick intro into why this program is happening tonight and to the relationship between Walter and Lamont early in the 1960s in New York.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating. There are certain composers who their world is really the visual art world and not the musical world. It's almost like an alternate trajectory of modernism, because Lamont Young doesn't really figure in a conventional look at contemporary music. I mean, he's kind of seen as an offshoot, but he comes out of a tradition that I think you can trace at least back to Eric Satie in Paris and his involvement with the Dadaists and the Surrealists, and his compositions, many of which had a kind of conceptual aspect to them. And then Satie, who turns into being a tremendous influence on John Cage, who's really the grandfather of a lot of this. I mean, you can't, all of these people were so influenced by John Cage, and who thought of himself more as an inventor than as a composer, and who, again, experimented with all kinds of ideas and was very influenced by Satie and Satie's sense of time. Because I think time becomes a big part of how one experiences something like The Broken Kilometer, as well as how one experiences music that came out of this movement. And then, of course, Morton Feldman. I can't talk about this period without talking about Morton Feldman, who's about 10 years older than Lamont Young and Walter Di Maria, who were born within, 10 days of each other in 1935. And Morton Feldman, very involved with the abstract expressionists, again, about, I guess most of those painters were also born in about 1925. So this is like a 10-year later generation, but they're coming of age with all of that in the air, and I think coming very much out of that world of these intersections of visual art and music. So, Michael, tell us about your involvement with Lamont Young and how that influenced you and what that was all like.
Sure. So just a little bit about Lamont Young, for those of you that don't know his work and don't know about him. He's considered the grandfather of minimalism. So he had a tremendous effect on Terry Riley, and who had an enormous effect on Philip Glass and Steve Reich. And minimalism is, by some, considered one of the most important movements in contemporary music or classical music of the 20th century. And Lamont was a very radical person. He's still alive, a very radical person. He's the most unusual person I've ever known, probably. He's lived for decades on a 27-hour-a-day schedule, just to give you one idea of how radical his life is. And he's still living in the same loft in downtown Tribeca, downtown New York, that he moved into in 1963. So that's going on 60 years now. And just had a birthday concert a few weeks ago. His first early famous work is Trio for Strings, 1958, which is regarded as the precursor for minimalism in music. It's all long sustained tones and rests played by a string trio. And no one had really ever written anything like that. It's a kind of equivalent in the music world of what was happening in minimalism in the art world. And his other work that is very famous that really is in the art world is the Dream House. The Dream House is an installation that's been happening in various configurations since the 1960s. The Dia Art Foundation, who were Lamont Young's patrons and were founded by Dominique de Menil's daughter, whose name was originally Filippa Polizzi, and now her name is Sheikha Faria. So she was both Lamont Young's patron and Walter de Maria's patron. Actually, not her and her husband, Heiner, who founded the Dia Art Foundation. So the Dream House is an installation. I mentioned the Dia Foundation because they actually purchased the rights to it, and there eventually will be a permanent installation of the Dream House, probably in New York. And the other work, which Lamont considers his masterpiece, is the Well-Tuned Piano, which, when I first met Lamont in 1979, I had the good fortune to get to be his piano tuner and composition assistant. So I came from Nowheresville, Oregon, to New York City and got to live in Lamont's loft in the early to mid 1980s and learn his piece, the well-tuned piano, and tune the piano for all his concerts and recording sessions. So the well-tuned piano started in 1964 when he was experimenting with pure or just intervals on a little upright piano, and continued all the way until his last concert in 1987, May 10th, 1987. And that concert was 6 hours and 24 minutes continuous. So it's generally regarded as his masterpiece. Unfortunately, there's no commercial CDs or DVDs available of it, but you can hear it on YouTube, or you can actually buy the DVD from Lamont's foundation, the Mela Foundation. So, working with Lamont, maybe before I talk about my relationship with Lamont, I'll say a little bit about his relationship with Walter de Maria. So, Lamont says that and I had the good fortune, I got to talk to Lamont about his relationship with Walter de Maria before coming here. And he says that he knew Walter longer than anyone in the art world as we know it. So they became very close friends starting in the late 50s when they were both graduate students at UC California in Berkeley. They did a number of performances together, also with Terry Riley, and I can read you a little bit about that. They both moved to New York around 1960. They both lived in lofts in Tribeca or Soho. And they both combined the music world and the art world. So Lamont's work, maybe more than any other composer I've known, belongs equally in the art world as it does in the world of music. And we've heard from Brad how involved Walter was with music in the early part of his life. They both focus on what I'd call time shifting, on long-term durations, even focusing on the static. And this had a huge effect on many other artists, including Andy Warhol. They were both very influenced by John Cage. And, Lamont's famous for the statement saying, "I'm probably the most influential composer of all time." So you might not hear Lamont talking about who his influences were, but he definitely was very influenced by Cage. And he came in touch with Cage's work in 1959 when he went to the Darmstadt Festival in Germany and met his colleague David Tudor. Both artists used instruction-based compositions, and the idea of controlling the outcome was very important. It's also interesting that they shared the same patrons, right? So there was really a lot of similarities. And I think they both had a strong influence on each other. We know that Lamont had a huge influence on Walter de Maria. Even just the composition that Brad talked about from 1960, Draw a Straight Line, Follow It. Well, there's a work of Walter de Maria's, maybe you could just speak for a moment about it, that's kind of similar.
The one in the desert?
Yeah.
Walter was very interested in pieces. There's a piece that was essentially intended to be a mile-long chalk line through the desert, and the idea was that you walk this line, and as you walk along it, you become very aware of your surroundings, you become more self-aware, and you're aware of your activity. So it's the idea of duration kind of enhancing your understanding and awareness of self and moment.
I think that Walter de Maria also had a big influence on Lamont. Lamont didn't tell me that, but he must have influenced Lamont's whole trajectory in the art world. So that's my take on that. Another similarity is there's a Zen-like quality to both of their works, although Jung is a definitive mystic, and that's not something you could say about Walter de Maria. Another thing is the title of the exhibit here, boxes for Meaningless Work. And maybe Lamont's pieces started, in the late 50s and the 60s, having this kind of sense of, not a sense of meaningfulness, but definitely as his life and work went on, it went the other direction, where, for example, if you went to a concert, any concerts of Lamont, you'd get handed a whole booklet of program notes with incredible details about the work, the history of the work, basically what it means, what it is. So there was a lot of meaningfulness ascribed from Lamont about his work. So I'll read you just a few things in Lamont's own words. Let's see, where do I have that? Here we go. So this is a nice one. On July 3rd, 1960 at 8 p.m., Walter, Terry Riley, and I played a concert at the Old Spaghetti Factory in San Francisco. I performed my composition 1960, number 3, in which I announced to the audience that everyone could do whatever they wished for the duration of the composition. Walter presented 2 pieces that I've always liked. One of them was called Licorice Stick, 1960, in which he took a package of licorice sticks and distributed a stick to each person in the audience. Anyone who knows me knows that I've been addicted to licorice for my entire life, among other things. Walter pulled the performance off with his typical charm. The other piece he performed was called Bats, 1960, in which he stood over a table with a baseball bat and proceeded to break the table to pieces. It was a little bit sensationalist, being just across the bay from the Berkeley Academy. It made a point. All 1,000 copies of the first edition of Anthology, this is Lamont's book, were collated at Walter's loft on Bond Street in 1963. It was quite a gathering. Many artists and musicians from the downtown art scene came to help collate. The pages were stacked on long tables that Walter provided, and everybody filed around them, picking up pages and putting them in order. For entertainment, Billy Higgins played drums, and Sandy Bull played guitar. It was really very beautiful. And I'll just end with this. One of the highest points in my relationship with Walter was in the 1960s when we would go see Sajayat Ray's Jalsaghar, The Music Room, 1958. This film had a very deep meaning for me, and I think for Walter as well. This is a real precursor because Lamont ended up devoting, from starting 1970, he became a disciple of Pandit Pranath, who is his Indian music guru, and I am also a disciple of Pandit Pranath. This film had a very deep meaning for me, and I think for Walter as well. It was the story of a Maharaja, a wealthy landowner, who was gradually using up his entire fortune. For those of you who know the history of the Maharajas, some of them were extraordinary patrons of the arts, keeping many singers, instrumentalists, and dancers of the highest caliber in their courts. The Maharaja decided to take his last pennies and present a major private concert with the greatest performers of his time in his music room. We really loved listening to the music and absorbing the atmosphere of Indian culture. We left with a sense of romantic, head-in-the-clouds idealism that was so foreign to our Western commercialism. And when Brad showed me the exhibit yesterday, we had a conversation about this, that maybe this sowed the seed in both of their minds about having a patron that would support their work, because it was shortly after this that they came in contact with Sheikh Afaria and Heiner Friedrich, who became their lifelong patrons.
It's so fascinating, the relationship and these influences, and I want to focus a little bit on Pandit Pranath and the idea of the Indian influence on all of this. I mean, the idea of Zen, of course, had a huge influence on John Cage and opened up a world of his experimental work. But your whole thing of coming to this idea of a differently tuned piano, first you had been studying Indian music, right? Long before you met Lamont Young. Like you mentioned, you came to New York and you ended up Lamont Young's assistant. I think there's kind of a story missing in the middle of that. And how did all of that happen, and the Indian music, its influence on you before you even met Lamont Young?
So I first became interested in Indian music as a teenager. I heard Ravi Shankar and Alaraka play at Berklee College of Music and was totally fascinated. I also went to India when I was 15, so I had some exposure to the music and culture then. And then I studied Indian music and world music in my first year at University of Oregon School of Music. And I heard about Pandit Pranath, this amazing master Indian vocalist that was living in Berkeley. So I went all the way down to Berkeley and heard a concert with Pranath and Terry Riley at Mills College. And then I knew I wanted to become his student. I was fortunate to meet him later at the Omega Institute in New York. And in fact, I approached Pranath and asked if I could study with him. And he was just recovering from a heart attack. So he suggested I study with an expert, Lamont Young. So I had my first lesson in this little house at this school that this Omega Institute was renting for the summer, sitting on the floor with Lamont Young, and Pandit Pranath is lying on the bed right next to me. And that began a lifelong study of Indian music, which I continue to this day. After a year of singing Indian ragas, playing the tambura, which is a very resonant drone instrument with a lot of harmonics, the main instrument of my life, the piano, started sounding out of tune. So I called the piano tuner came and tuned it, and it still sounded out of tune. So I started studying the physics of sound and acoustics, and what I realized is that Western music in our tuning is compromised. It's called temperament. Basically, if you tune a piano with pure intervals like they would naturally occur in the physics of sound, where everything is lined up perfectly with the resonances of sound, well, you're going to have a limited number of notes that can have this kind of perfect resonance, but some of the notes, the way they relate to each other, will create extreme dissonances, which are called wolf tones, because in the Renaissance they were so dissonant that they reminded people of the howling of wolves. And the technical term for them is commas. So Pythagoras figured out one of the most important commas 2,500 years ago, and it has his name, the Pythagorean comma. So there are these slight cracks where the intervals don't line up. And these intervals sounded so dissonant to people in the Renaissance that when they were developing the first keyboard instruments and lutes, that they wanted to find a way to avoid them. So, for example, if you have one note that's perfectly in tune with another note, but out of tune with another one, you could split the difference. So it would be equally usable in both contexts, but out of tune, but modestly out of tune in both contexts. So that's what temperament is. And there was a huge war, really, that went on for a couple hundred years, which is outlined beautifully in the book Temperament by Stuart Isikoff, that is kind of the equivalent of what's happening now with racial equality and with the environment, concern about the environment, where popes, heads of state, most of the great thinkers of the time, Galileo, Newton, Descartes, Rameau, Michelangelo, all weighed in on the subject. Do we alter the God-given ratios of music for a convenient system where we can avoid these dissonances? And this went on actually for hundreds of years until eventually the piano manufacturers, not the musicians, cemented in the equal temper tuning, which has become the dominant tuning of the world today. So I started these experiments working in just intonation, just by ear, and then I had the good fortune to work with Lamont Young to learn his work, the well-tuned piano, to tune his amazing custom Busendorfer Imperial Concert Grand in a private concert hall that was temperature humidity controlled, and perfect the tuning for his piece. And the well-tuned piano is the main influence in my two main piano works. The first is called From Ancient Worlds, from the mid-90s, and the other one is Revelation, which I'll be performing entirely on Saturday. The tuning does not just take the overtones from the harmonic series, it's actually very specific overtones, and it focuses on some of the commas. So while as the commas were obliterated from music with temperament, the tuning for Revelation, like the well-tuned piano by Lamont Young, actually exposes the commas and uses them, and you can hear the kind of shimmering, pulsating qualities where you can just play a couple notes and they actually create their own rhythmic pulse. So there's a lot of beautiful things about working with commas that have been obliterated, unfortunately, in the history of music.
One of the things we were talking about earlier is the piano is a very modern instrument, and it's the ultimate, in a way, Western instrument exactly because of this, because of the tuning having been determined in such a specific way, and that this was really starting to take root when Bach published in 1722 his Well-Tempered Clavier, which was a series of preludes and fugues in the major and minor keys of every note on the piano, filling all 12 tones. So C major, C minor, C sharp major, C sharp minor, and a way of doing that without retuning the instrument for each key, which is the kind of thing that would have happened on a harpsichord, where people would tune the piano to fit the tonality that they were playing in. But the piano, unlike the voice, which is the most flexible of instruments, once it's tuned like this, you can't change the tuning. So this kind of averaging out, which was agreed upon, then became the basis for really all of Western music that came afterwards. So this idea of moving away from that naturally came from the cultures that had not followed tempered tuning, and which would be China and India, and actually it's only specific to this European tradition. But it's a wonderful, as so many things in modern art are, it's taking something very modern, but the inspiration comes from something that had been ancient and almost forgotten. When Bach himself was hired for his new job in Leipzig in 1723, he was hired to teach music and mathematics because music was viewed still as a science. And I think one other thing to say about the tuning that people may not realize is that there's the tempered tuning, but then there's not just one alternate tuning. The kind of tuning that Michael is doing for his piece is different than Lamont Young's tuning. So how the piano is tuned becomes a creative compositional act in and of itself.
Exactly. And actually I have numerous tunings, different tunings for different works that I've created, and even tunings for other instruments like string quartet or cello or voices. I have a piece for the vocal group Roomful of Teeth, also in just intonation. So it's really an infinite system where every different whole number proportion creates a different musical relationship. Like 2-to-1 proportion gives you an octave, 3-to-2 proportion gives you a perfect fifth. And this isn't just math, it's actually the vibrations in the air. So when one vibration is exactly 3 times for 2 of another, you get an interval that sounds like an extremely consonant interval we call the perfect fifth.
I think we need to hear something in order to get an idea about what all of this is about. So you're going to play a movement of Revelation. Is there any other demonstration or anything you want to do, or just to play that as the best?
So Revelation is an hour-and-a-half piece, and it's continuous in 12 different sections. So I'm going to play you section 6, which is Tone Cloud 2. So we're jumping right into the middle of the piece. The piece starts very gradually and kind of introduces your ear to some of the new tonalities. So we're going to skip over that and just jump in the middle.
Great, thank you so much. Incredibly hypnotic and sensual experience to hear that resonance, and I'm sure that has provoked some questions. We're going to give a chance for people to ask some questions, but I have some questions myself. First, about the piece. Maybe it would be a good time. This section is Tone Cloud 2, but you have this whole work that will be performed on Saturday at 3, and there's a kind of alternation of night vigils and tone clouds. And do you want to talk about that a little bit, compositionally, structurally?
Sure. So structurally, there are 4 tone clouds, and these are the climaxes of the piece that have a lot of notes and require a lot of effort. And the last one, Tone Cloud 4, builds over a course, well, with the finale before it and then Tone Cloud 4, there's like a constant building over the course of the last half hour. And it ends with huge four-arm clusters, you know, where you play with your forearm on the black keys, but because of the tuning, the way it's designed, it doesn't sound like how you normally play on a piano, which would be extremely dissonant. It actually just creates kind of this beautiful cosmic wall of sound.
This didn't have any black keys, what you just played.
No,
did
this
it
is,
did, really?
yes.
It did?
Oh yeah,
because it doesn't sound like it.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it sounds so consonant that way. I thought it was mainly like the C major keys. That's really interesting.
No, there's a lot of black keys.
Now I want to hear them individually without your...
Can you hear the difference between this note and this note?
Oh, so you see? That's a black key. So that's not what we would call, like normally that, I hate to say normally, conventionally, that would be tuned a half step apart.
Which normally would sound like that, but here's C, here's C sharp. Actually, it's lower. And we were talking about this whole number of proportions. Well, this note is 64 vibrations for every 63 vibrations of this.
Can you keep going up chromatically? Sorry to use that obsolete term. Okay, so you can hear why playing Bach would not sound good on that piano.
Right, and actually to play in this, that 3 notes are lower as you go up. So to play an ascending scale, I have to play zigzag. So the black keys create these combos. So what they were avoiding in the Renaissance was intervals that sounded like this. Those are going to occur if you don't use temperament. So you're going to have perfect fifths.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's important to hear because there was, well, I keep saying hypnotic and the sensual quality of, I mean, there's a lot of pleasure in here. There's not tension in the way we would think of tension and resolution in traditional tonal music, right? There's more of, it's more like that painting or something. I mean, there's more of texture and interaction and different resonances.
And it's what you call modal music, right? So it's in one mode throughout the piece, but it has the commas to provide an extra dimension.
Yeah, really fascinating. Okay, questions from...
So I have a mic here, so just raise your hand if you have a question. Thank you. That was fantastic. When you're tuning your piano, do you do it by ear, or do you have a instrument, a tool to tell you what the notes are?
It's tuned entirely by ear.
I have to jump in just to give a credit to our wonderful piano technician, Jim Kozak, because this is really his virtuosic tour de force. And years ago, I don't know, maybe it was as much as 10 years, many as 10 years ago, I had heard about Michael's work, and I had gotten excited listening to it, and I immediately texted a link to our piano technician saying, would you do this? Would you tune the piano so that we can have Michael do this? And he was totally excited about it. And in preparation for tuning this piano, he practiced on a piano at home. But Michael has extremely specific guidelines that the tuner can work from, but he needs to use an ear. There's no machine that'll do it, right?
You could do it with a machine. It's been done with a machine, but it's better to do it by ear because then you can balance all the different registers and the intervals really well. I tune my pianos at home, but for a concert it's too much to retune the piano and also prepare to perform the work. So it's fantastic to have tuners with open minds like Jim, who really perfected the tuning. I mean, from the moment I first rehearsed on it, it was perfect.
I come to this as a cellist. Throughout Western music, there certainly were instruments that weren't really tuned. Sarah, you mentioned human voice, and I of course think of all the non-fretted instruments. Those can play anything you want. Did you find, as you started exploring maybe the boundaries of tempered tuning, did you turn to those resources? Say an a cappella group or a string quartet?
I didn't hear everything you said, but I think I got the gist of it. I actually, outside of the piano, I've written the most for cello. So I have 3 big cello works, and I'm working on a 4th one now, because cello is a fantastic instrument for just intonation because you have the full range, and you don't have fixed pitches, so you can play any pitch in between. And I tend to work with multi-track cello, so many layers that are pre-recorded. So probably the most well-known piece I have for cello is called Just Ancient Loops, recorded by Maya Beiser. And then there's Cello Constellations, which is like 20 tracks of cello with electronics for Clarice Jensen. And I'm working on a piece now for Jake Sharkey. So I'm happy to talk to you about those pieces if you're interested in checking them out.
Thank you. I had a question that maybe would sort of circle us back to your relationship to Lamont Young's legacy. And listening to your playing in just intonation and this kind of wall of sound that you're able to create produces a kind of sense of overwhelming wholeness and abundance of sound that in some ways takes us away from Lamont Young's early minimalism. And I was wondering if his use of just intonation has become a more kind of received part of his legacy among contemporary composers, perhaps than a sort of sense of a spare, silence-laden minimalism.
Well, if you listen to the well-tuned piano, there are some sections where he builds these walls of resonance that he calls clouds for as long as an hour. So there are, and it's incredibly beautiful, and that's what really captivated me the most about the well-tuned piano. And then there's these very delicate, sparse sections. And I do the same thing in my piece, because also you can't just play all out, for extended period of time. You need like a little bit of a break. So it's good to play something, and also to give the ear a break. So Revelation has these things like night vigils that are in between, that are more lyrical, melodic sections. But yes, some of Lamont's work definitely has these kind of big walls of sound, whether it's the well-tuned piano or even the Dream House. The Dream House, for those of you who haven't experienced it, is quite unusual. If you come to New York, please come and see it. It's a wall of sound of electronic tones, but it's so perfectly tuned that there's hundreds of tones, and when you turn your head a fraction of an inch, you hear different tones in every part of the room because it's setting up like a geometric pattern of standing waves where the nodes of the vibrations are different literally in every single tiny, tiny molecule of the space. So, did that answer your question? Yeah.
It's interesting that, I mean, your piece, this one is about 90 minutes, and Lamont Young's piece is
Grew to be 6.5 hours.
Grew to be 6.5 hours over time. I mean, it's interesting, the importance of duration, because visually, when you look at something like The Broken Kilometer, there's a similar sense of the importance of duration. And do you link that to Eastern philosophy, a spiritual sense? I mean, it seems like duration is important even in the visual work that we're talking about.
I agree, and I think that's really kind of maybe the key connection between Walter de Maria and Lamont Young and my work, is this idea of trying to achieve some kind of universal state through music, where it changes your experience of time. And I think, I haven't been to the lightning field, but Brad was telling me about it, and I can imagine being there, it changes your perception of time. And certainly the same thing is true with the well-tuned piano. I mean, I sat through something like 60 concerts and recording sessions of the well-tuned piano, and it's like getting on a plane and getting off in LA from New York. You know, but I was just sitting there next to the piano the whole time, no break. And I would definitely go through time warps. So sometimes an hour just felt like that. And sometimes it felt longer.
Well, the other thing that happens, I find, with these long pieces, I played for Philip Guston, the Morton Feldman, which takes about 4.5 hours, that it becomes like life itself. And when the piece stops, it's just overwhelming that it has stopped. I mean, I always I burst into tears practically at the end of that moment, because it's like life itself becomes the piece, and you have to be in a state that continues for a significant length of time in order for that effect to it. And I guess the desert has a similar, these unending spaces, the idea of the mile in the desert. And yeah, it's interesting, the visual sense of time, which you don't think of as being contained, and then how it plays out in music.
And it totally relates to the tuning system, just intonation, because, for example, a lot of traditional Western music over the hundreds of years that we've used temperament moves along at a pretty fast clip. So when the music is moving fast, you don't really notice the temperament. But if you're doing music of sustained tones and long durations, then you start to hear the compromises of the temperament. So then you really need just intonation. And so Lamont really made that connection, because a lot of his music is about long sustained tones, and it's natural that it would benefit from just intonation, as a lot of medieval music would be, or even organs are typically not tuned in equal temperament. They're tuned in a different form of temperament that would favor certain keys, because the tempered intervals would sound too out of tune all the time when they're sustained.
I think we have time, yeah.
A question for Brad. You mentioned that some of the pieces in the exhibition have auditory components to them, which of course today we can't really experience. I also noticed that you appear to have built some replicas. Was any thought given to making those replicas available to the public so that we could experiment, play, almost like a children's museum?
I think, I'm not 100% certain, but I do believe there will be some programming opportunities where the replicas will come out, so that people have the opportunity to experience those works as Walter had wanted them to. So yeah, keep an eye on the website for that.
Hi, if I may, one more. Tangentially, but also related, we talked a lot about different kinds of tunings. Indonesian gamelans almost all have their own tuning. So like village to village, literally the tunings are different from each one. So just how much variety there could be in tuning. But I read on the program notes on Cantaloupe Music where one can get Revelation. You can also get it on Bandcamp. I'm giving a little bit of pitch here. But Michael's got a really profoundly interesting program notes on there on Cantaloupe Music. And you mentioned that the inspiration or the revelation of this tuning came to you in Paris when you were at a concert with 3 other musicians. And I'm just, without trying to be invasive, I'm wondering sort of if you know what prompted the sense of this one particular tuning that you're going to be playing to on Saturday.
Right. So was always thinking, am still thinking about different tunings. And when it was actually in Rome in 1999, in November, so right at the end of the millennium. And we did 5 concerts, Philip Glass, Charlemagne Palestine, Terry Riley, and myself, and then one concert where we all performed together, one after the other on the same night. And so I was playing my work From Ancient Worlds, and Terry Riley was playing a new work, The Dream, which was also, has never been recorded, which was also in his own just intonation tuning and also inspired by Lamont Young's The Well-Tuned Piano. So I was kind of swimming in these things, listening to Terry's piece and performing my own, and I was thinking about new possibilities. So after the last concert, I woke up at 4 in the morning with the tuning. And the tuning means just a configuration of the tones. How do you, because there's many different ways you can lay out the tones over a 12-note keyboard, but what would really kind of be intuitive and what would make sense and give the kind of harmonic structure I wanted to explore. And so that's why I called it Revelation. And it has to do with the white and black keys, because the white keys form a series of fifths and the black keys form another series of fifths, which make it extremely intuitive. And when you combine the black and the white keys, you get the commas and these very colorful, unusual sounds. So that was kind of the realization that came at that point.
I have a question. Yep. I had a question of maybe a sort of metaphorical, different idea of temperament, but I was curious to ask you all. I know something of Walter de Maria and Lamont Young's and their work, but it's hard when you're kind of reading and looking into this stuff to get a sense of them and the kind of process of the creative process. And I was especially wanting to ask about the presence of humor in some of these concepts, and because I get a sense of that, but I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be, if that's me, or if there really is that inherent in the work, a kind of humor. And the closeness of deep seriousness and silliness is really something that strikes me about the show.
Right. Do you want to come in?
I can only speak with my experience of Walter's work, but I think, I think he would be disappointed if we missed the humor and the absurdity, especially in a lot of those early works. But I think, I would think it's also, I think it runs throughout the entire career, but I think it's most obvious and evident, in the early works, the absurdity of them, for sure.
And you find it in Lamont Young's work too, like there's a section of the Well-Tuned Piano, the Brontosaurus Boogie.
The Brontosaurus Boogie.
The Brontosaurus Boogie. So you find it, it's really deep in the low end. Makes the piano growl.
Well, maybe that's a good image to leave us all with. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, Brad and Michael. Thank you all for coming. And come back on at 3 o'clock on Saturday. Even if there's not room for you to sit in there, I'm sure the whole museum will be filled with the resonance of Michael's music, so you'll be able to experience it.